Pamela Winters had dressed modestly for her first excursion into Stragview. The warden had a very specific task in mind, and he had promised her double her usual rate if she could get results. She presented her credentials at the gate, and after a trip through the metal detector and a thorough search of her belongings, she was told to proceed to the warden's office. She doubted that visitors were usually allowed to bring in implements for brewing tea, but her brother had likely given them special orders to let her through with whatever she needed to get his information. She had chosen one of her more modest pantsuits, and she was still aware of the eyes on her as she passed the orderlies working in the hallway. She imagined that most of them hadn't seen anyone like her in a while, but the attention was less than flattering. She didn't have to guess which door was his. It was printed in large, gaudy letters across the front of the pebbled glass window. He had always had a flair for dramatic presentation, and his current form was far from low profile. She imagined that the warden of Stragview played a part in many of the inmates' nightmares. She knocked and was told to enter, the man in the pinstripe suit looking smugly over the top of his cup as he drank. She made a face as the smell of Earl Grey hit her in full. When it came to tea, it seemed he had less refined tastes. "So nice of you to finally join us," he said, smiling at her through the steam of his cup. "We can't all work through the holidays like you, dear brother." He cocked a leg on his knee, studying her through the rising condensation that had turned his glasses steamy. "Sorry, prisons never close. Holidays are just another day for us. I trust you've been having fun in your little den amongst the sheep." "Pleasantries were never your strong suit," Pamela said as she took a seat across from him. "Let's get down to business. What do you want?" The warden shook his head and tutted a little. "You've lived in the shadow of my prison for so many years, and yet you never came to say hello or have a chat with me. Some people might think you were trying to avoid me." "Smart people would," Winter said icily. "Now what do you want?" The warden sat back, still wearing that Cheshire Cat's grin as he sipped his tea. "I have a problem I seem incapable of brute-forcing my way through." "Subtlety was ever your speed, though I imagine it's easier to find brutes in a place like this," Winter quipped, taking a species of smug satisfaction from his need to ask for help. The warden, however, chose to ignore her attempts at needling him. "There is an object of power loose in my prison. Well, there are several, actually, but this one is the most troubling at the moment." "And why is that?" "Oh, some capricious god has decided to mess with me, very likely. Happens more than you would—" No, I mean, why is this one more dangerous than the others?" At that, her brother seemed uncomfortable. "That's not relevant to your questions," the warden said, a little too quickly for Winter's liking. "Am I at least allowed to know what it is that I'm looking for?" The warden seemed to give this some serious thought before agreeing to some breadcrumbs. "It's a small stone idol. That's all you need to know." Winter wanted to tell him that was far from all she needed to know, but decided to leave it at that. Her brother was not his usual self, and that spoke volumes about this thing he was looking for. He was fidgety and unsure of himself in a way that he was trying very hard to hide. Winter hadn't seen him in close to 1,000 years, and this was the first time that she had seen him like this. Her brother was never the type to rely on brute force, and generally relied on plans within plans. In that respect, he was more like their father, and that sort of intrigue was ultimately the reason that she had left home. He had changed very little in that respect, and it ultimately reminded her that, at the end of the day, All he sought was their father's acceptance, something he was unlikely to ever find. "Do you have a place where I can set up?" As it happened, he did. Winter settled herself in a little room where inmates met with their attorneys, and he sent one of his guards, Ingram by the stitching on his shirt, to go retrieve the inmate in question. As he stood in the doorway, fidgeting and walking around nervously, she brewed her tea and made herself comfortable. As the smell of winter cherry and ginseng cascaded over him, he smirked, also picking up the baser elements and understanding the nature of the brew. "Just like our mother. You always believed that the answers could be found in the stomach. And just like our father, you always believed that you could find what you lack in intrigue, rather than honest discussion." That shut him up, and she was glad. He had always been a nasty know-it-all who was never content to know less than those around him. As the man came in a few minutes later, Winter could tell that he'd been touched by something dark. He looked as if he had aged rapidly, shrinking to nearly a toddler's size. His skin hung on him like an old man, and his eyes were dull and listless. She wasn't going to get much out of this one. Not from his mouth, anyway. She was going to have to go in and take the knowledge that she needed, something she hated to do. "What's his name?" The warden looked surprised. "What? His name? What is his name?" He looked at the guard who had brought the man in, and Ingram gravelled out that the man's name was Dryer. "Very well, Mr. Dryer, I'm going to help you get some of that out of your head. Just relax. I'm not going to hurt you. It's best if you drink a little of this," she said as she pressed the cup to his lips. "Lean forward and let me work." Without a word, the man did lean forward and sipped from the offered cup. It was as if he was eager to have whatever was in his mind out too. Winter reached forward, placing her hands on his head, and let her fingertips sink into the bald, flaky scalp. Officer Ingram gasped as her fingers slipped through the skin, reaching for the mace on his belt with a shaky hand. "Warden, she can't," the guard started, but the warden told him to go have a smoke break, and he would call him when they needed him. As the door closed, the warden rolled his hand lazily at her, indicating her to proceed. Winter nodded, closing her eyes as she got to work. He had found it on the rec yard. Some inmates like to exercise during rec. Some of them like to play sports. Some of them just like to walk around and enjoy the fresh air. Nathan Dryer liked to dig. He had liked to dig since he was a child, and it was something that followed him into adulthood. He had gone from building sandcastles and little construction sites to digging holes to inspect bugs or things he found with his metal detector. His metal detector was actually what had brought him here in the first place, and when he had been found digging up bullet fragments on federal property, they had arrested him and hit him with 5 years for trespassing. Nathan was just trying to do his time so he could get back to the real world, but Stragview was about to impose itself on him in a way that he could never expect. Nathan had learned pretty quickly not to dig very deep. As Yard Sergeant Bailey had informed him, he was doing something that could be seen as an escape attempt. So Nathan never dug very deep, and he was always careful never to dig near the fence. He was also careful to fill in his holes when he was done. That way the people playing sports didn't trip in them. Neither would the guards doing a rec yard check later that night, which would almost be worse. The last thing he wanted was an additional charge for assaulting staff by having them trip in one of his holes. So, there he was, digging around near the north side of the walking track as he looked for bugs and worms, and just marveling at the wet red clay that he found there. He had been told that this was where they started the mines that were supposed to lay under Stragview, but he had never seen them. No one to his knowledge had ever seen the mines. They had been closed in the 60s after a pretty nasty accident. Nathan wished they were still open. That sounded like the perfect job for him. He could just go down into the earth for 12 hours and dig till his heart was content. "Playing in the dirt again, eh, Dryer?" Dryer ignored Lance as he attempted to get under his skin. He was one of those guys that like to pick on people, and the weirder the hobby, the more he picked. He seemed to take the fact that Nathan liked to dig as a personal insult. He probably saw picking on him as a way to get him to stop, but if that had worked, Nathan would have stopped digging in the 4th grade. "Maybe you can dig yourself up some friends," Lance said as Nathan went right on ignoring him. He heard it when the large man took a step in his direction, but he had already committed to not interacting with him. If there was one thing Nathan hated worse than weird hobbies, it was being ignored. "Hey, freak, I'm talking to you. Clean the dirt out of your ears." Nathan leaned down a little, his finger having brushed something hard and rough. He wanted to know what it was, maybe a cool rock or a beetle, but as Lance got closer, Nathan thought he might not have a chance to get at it. He was saved from further harassment by the yard sergeant calling an end to wreck. Dryer buried his hole again and went to line up with the others, Lance bumping him as he jogged past. Dryer gritted his teeth, wanting to say something nasty back to him, but stopping himself. He had no friends, no gang to help him, and he was practically alone. As Nathan got in line to go back to the dorms, he wished he could dig up some friends, as Lance had suggested. Then maybe he wouldn't be so alone. He had started to walk back in, but he stopped suddenly and looked back at the spot where he'd been digging. Something was calling to him from there, something that really wanted him to go back to digging. As the sergeant yelled at him to hurry up, Nathan started walking again, committing that spot to memory so he could go back there next time. A couple of days later, Nathan was back on the rec yard, digging in the dirt again. He was keeping a wary eye out this time, not wanting to get harassed by Lance again, but he refused to stop what brought him joy. He had a good feeling about this spot, the same spot he'd been digging in the other day, and he wondered if it would be a bug or a rock or maybe a coin or something that someone had lost out here ages ago. There was a gross-looking soap dish in his locker that the officers never bothered to open during searches, and that was where he kept his treasures. There was a long gold fleck in there that he'd found by the pavilion, a dime from 1963, and the remains of a stag beetle that had burrowed down into the clay. They were the closest thing he had to treasures, and he guarded them jealously. "Looks like Dig Dug's at it again," came a familiar voice from behind him. Dryer sighed. Lance had found him earlier than expected. He had started to say something back, but winced as his finger came into contact with something hard, and it nearly ripped his nail off. Dryer looked down to find the top of the stony object again, and as he wiggled it and pried it loose, it finally came free from the dirt. "Hey, freak, I'm talking to you," Lance yelled, clearly not liking being ignored. It was a little stone carving of a screaming face, and despite being horrific, Nathan couldn't look away. It was so strange to find something like this, so unique, so unthought of. "When I talk to you, you respond to me, freak. I'm sick of getting the cold shoulder from someone like..." But Lance had seen the idol now, and it stopped him in his tracks. He had a hand resting on Nathan's shoulder, but the fingers that usually dug into his skin were loose and uncoordinated. Nathan looked and saw that Lance was looking at the idol, and he clearly liked what he saw. The guy had been walking with a skinny trustee named Worthy, and he was asking him what it was as he came over to have a look. Suddenly, two speechless people were standing over him, looking at the carving with reverence. "Wow, Dryer, that's a cool little thing you found there," Lance half whispered. "Yeah," Worthy said. "Think we could have a look?" Nathan was shocked at their change in demeanor, and was eager to bring the carving over to the sitting area under the pavilion. He set it on the table, telling them they could look, but they weren't to touch. The two sat quietly like children in a museum, and looked at the fabulous carving for quite a while. Dreyer was amazed at how quickly they had come under its spell, but to his further amazement, others came to join them. By the time rec was over, Nathan had a group of 8 inmates standing around and looking at the little idol. When he went to line up for his dorm, he was surprised to see that the 8 from the pavilion came to stand beside him. They followed him all the way to the dorm, like ducks behind their mother, and when they got back to the day room, he set the idol down on the table and watched them marvel at it. It attracted others too, catching their eye as they went to watch TV or play cards, and soon the table wasn't big enough to hold them all. That seemed to be when the dorm officer took notice, and Dreyer thought the jig might be up when Officer Wellerman came waddling onto the floor. Wailerman to the residents of E-Dorm, was a big-bellied guard who seemed to enjoy lording what little power he had over his charges. He had some weak-chinned TA in there with him tonight, which meant they'd have to suffer him being on the floor more than usual. Wellerman didn't think people who couldn't carry gas had a place on the floor, and as he came towards their little gathering, he had an ear-to-ear grin for them. "Evening, gentlemen. What you got there? Some kind of bug, or maybe some drugs that I need to—" He stopped talking when he saw the idol, and the grin slipped right off his face. He pushed in between a couple of the gawkers and just stared at it as it sat on the table. He was amazed by the little statue, his eyes as wide as a child's on Christmas morning. Whatever power the idol held over him was working overtime if it had managed to net a fat fish like Wellerman. As Nathan watched him, he began to realize that they could use this to their advantage. He just wasn't sure how much power this thing had over the officer yet. "Officer Wellerman?" he asked, leaning down a little. "Do you like my little friend there?" "Yeah," the officer practically whispered. "Wouldn't you like to bring him a little gift? It would make him very happy." Wellerman nodded, his chin's wobbling. "First, invite your ward down here to have a look. Then listen very carefully." Wellerman tossed the Hershey bar on a Dreyer's bed the next night during master roster count, to the amazement of those in the dorm. He had looked a little shell-shocked when he came to work that day, some distance having taken away some of the idol's power. Not all, apparently, as the candy bar on his bed would attest. He had looked at Dreyer strangely when he'd come to work, clearly feeling the pull of the idol, and he wasn't alone. Dreyer's life had changed for the better in the last 24 hours. Now he had a small legion of followers that seemed to hang on his every word. They gave him extra food, they let him use the TV, and they hassled people who refused to fall in line. That was becoming a minority in the dorm, to be sure. His little flock from the day before had doubled, and Nathan was living the high life. He was the king of this brood for the most part, and now that Wellerman had proven to be under the idol's sway, he knew he could go further. "You should have asked for something bigger," Lance hissed, sitting back when Wellerman spun and glared at him. He waited till the guard had gone to the other wing before hissing, "Pack of smokes or something." Dreyer fixed him with a look, taking the idol out of his front pocket so Lance could see it. "Are you questioning my authority?" Lance looked angry for half a breath, but as the idol came into view, all his anger seemed to melt away. People seemed to listen to him when the idol was out where they could look at it, but once it was out of sight, they seemed to forget that they had decided to follow him. The idol held some power, but Nathan wasn't sure how far he wanted to push that power just yet. He had started with a candy bar, thinking that it might be the easiest way to test it. It wasn't technically against the rules to bring inmates candy, but it would be considered a real bitch move to do so. They likely figured he meant to eat it himself, and as the wrapper came off and Dreyer took that first savory bite, he relished the taste of milk chocolate. They got candy here, but it was usually old or slightly melted. It had been 3 years since Nathan had eaten a real, unmelted chocolate bar, and he savored every bite of it. Watching the gathering parishioners, their tongues sliding over greedy lips, Nathan knew he would have to rig up something so that they could see the idol at all times. A necklace, perhaps. As they sat behind the rec-yard shed a few days later, smoking Wellerman's latest gift, Dryer felt better than he had in a long time. He was wearing fresh clothes, clean underwear, new socks, and smoking a cigarette for the first time in years. His stomach was full for a change, and he had slept better than he had since going in. He had friends to talk to, instead of just the bugs that squirmed in the yard. He knew they weren't really his friends, not like the few he had had on the outside. They laughed at his jokes, and they shared their food with him, but he couldn't ignore the way that their eyes tracked the swing of the idol as it hung around his neck. He was careful to put it in his shirt when he wasn't around his friends, and so far no one had marked the string or seen the bulge in his shirt. Well, someone had. Someone he was about to regret getting mixed up with. Nathan coughed, suddenly racked with a series of railed gasps. That had been happening more and more lately, and yesterday he had spat a tooth into the sink as well. He wasn't sure why, but he had to think it had something to do with the idol. Maybe it was taking his energy in order to give him the gifts that he was receiving. Well, coughs and a few teeth were a small price to pay for the ability to sway others, and Nathan would give up all his teeth if it meant that he could spend his last year and a half in safety and comfort. The coughing was the reason that he noticed them at all. Nathan saw them as they approached, but he just figured they wanted to bum a smoke. He had used the idol to befriend the guard in the rec building, and he knew that no one would bother them, except for other inmates. There were 4 of them, all of them sporting long sleeves in the early fall heat. He had seen them around lately, keeping their heads together as they conspired, and most people thought they were some kind of new gang that was trying to form. It happened sometimes. Gangs came and went, but the old guard still remained in the end. As they approached, it was clear that they knew who he was, and likely suspected he was trying to form a gang of his own. "Greetings," said the head of the group, an older guy with a greasy ponytail and little gold glasses. "Would you mind if we had a word?" Nathan couldn't think of any reason why not, so he sent a few of his followers away. He kept a few of the bigger guys beside him, though, Lance and Gage and Michaels, just in case this was some kind of shakedown. The men he had brought with him were younger, but they were smaller. Dryer had little doubt that his 3 could whip all 4 of them if it came to it. "We understand you've found something we're looking for." Nathan furrowed his brow a little. It seemed they were getting right to the point. "You must mean this," he said, taking the idol out of his shirt. The man with the shiny tail of hair practically started drooling when he saw it, and the look was so intense that Nathan wanted to put it away before it got much worse. He'd seen something similar on the face of his newfound friends, but this look had something else in its depths. This was the look of a cancer patient who's seen a cure within easy reach. It's the way the junkie looked at a full hypo, and Dryer suddenly didn't feel very safe with just 3 guys around. The man looked as if he were contemplating murder, if it would get him that little rock figure. "We'd like to buy it from you. Name your price. We'll pay anything." Nathan did put it away then, seeing their intent. "It's not for sale. It's my most prized possession. I'd sooner sell you my left hand than this." The man smirked. "You wouldn't be the first one to make such a trade in this place." "Well, if you won't sell it, why not a loan? We only really need it for a little while. Then you can have it back. We'll even pay you for the trouble." Dryer thought about it, but in the end, he just couldn't stand the thought of being parted from it. He had owned it for such a short time, but the little thing meant so much to him that letting anyone else touch it seemed unthinkable. If he gave it to them, he would never see it again. He was as certain of that as he was that old One-Ear would eat his tuna packet if he left it unattended. This guy was part of something weird, maybe worse than a gang, and Nathan suddenly didn't want anything to do with him. "Afraid I'll have to pass, boys. Now head off, you're stinking up the joint." The man glowered at him a little, but then put his hands up in a placating way, and he was all smiles again. "Sorry you feel that way. We'll be going then." He left then, but Dryer doubted it was the last that he'd see of him. Suddenly, however, the idol rolled on his chest, and the woman looking in at his memories saw an eldritch glow rising in the sunken orbs. The idol held all the fires of hell, all the mysteries of creation, and as it engulfed her, it pushed her out of Nathan Dryer and back into herself. Winter came shivering up from his mind, the fingers of that faraway power feeling cold and alien as they shoved against her. The warden was beside her then, rattling questions into her ears so fast that she thought she might have whiplash. She pushed him away, trying to catch her breath so she could convey what she had seen. She hadn't seen all of it, but it was enough to show her exactly what they were dealing with. No. You didn't say we were getting involved with shit like this." "What? What was it? What did you see?" "I don't know exactly, but it's something I've heard of." "Capricious God, nothing. Someone is trying to sow real chaos in your prison. Something like this could turn the natural order on its ear." It may have already," the warden said sheepishly. Winter looked at him with horror, waiting for an explanation. The two stood for a moment, Winter staring at her brother, and the warden looking anywhere but at his sister. "Something has gained control of the idol, gained control of it about a week ago, and I need to know where it went before they use it to bring something into the prison that I can't stop." You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.